The galaxy had long since forgotten humanity's strength. Once, Earth had been the cradle of an empire that spanned countless star systems, its people capable of feats that seemed to defy the laws of nature. But centuries of subjugation at the hands of alien overlords had reduced humans to a myth, a race of little significance. To the alien species who now ruled the stars, humanity was an ancient relic, weak, scattered, and utterly broken. But they were wrong. Across the galaxy, on forgotten colonies and distant outposts, strange events began to unfold. People, ordinary humans, began to experience phenomena that defied explanation. At first, they dismissed these occurrences as nothing more than coincidences, strange dreams, or perhaps a fleeting moment of mental instability. But soon, the pattern became undeniable. Ordinary people, living quiet, unnoticed lives, began to tap into powers they didn't understand. Jackson, a young mechanic on a backwater mining world, was the first to notice. It started with his hands. One night, while repairing an old generator in the depths of a vast mining facility, his palms began to heat up uncontrollably. His heart raced, and his breath caught in his throat as the air around him vibrated with energy. In an instant, the metal panel he had been working on warped and bent, as if it were made of clay. His mind raced. Had it been an accident, or had something changed within him? But before he could consider the implications, he collapsed, his head spinning with visions of Earth, distant and unfamiliar. He wasn't alone. On a distant planet in the Andromeda system, a woman named Mira experienced something even stranger. While conducting routine research in a remote science facility, she suddenly felt a surge of raw power within her. The room around her seemed to warp as time itself appeared to slow. She reached out to steady herself, only to send a shockwave of energy rippling through the structure. Her colleagues in the adjoining rooms rushed to her aid, but by the time they arrived, she was already gone, fleeing into the wilderness as her newfound abilities overwhelmed her. She could feel something pulling her, an urge to search for others like her, as if some ancient call had awakened deep within her. The scattered humans, each experiencing their own strange awakenings, had no idea what was happening to them, but something deep within their blood stirred. It was as if their ancestors had left behind a seed, an incredible power buried within humanity's DNA, waiting for the right moment to emerge. They didn't know the full extent of their abilities, but they could feel the change. Their bodies were more than capable of feats they had never before imagined. Some began to harness it consciously, while others struggled to control it, terrified of what they had become. Meanwhile, the alien overlords, the Orcs, continued to rule with absolute authority, dismissing the signs of human awakening as inconsequential. They saw humanity as a conquered race, an afterthought, no longer a threat. They didn't know that the very strength they had buried under centuries of oppression was rising again. And as the last remnants of human pride stirred within these newfound champions, the Orcs remained blind to the storm that was coming for them. The first whispers of rebellion began to emerge, carried on the wind, as small pockets of humans began to search for others like them. They didn't yet know what they were fighting for, but they knew that something powerful and dangerous had awoken inside them, and they weren't willing to let it go. The time for humanity's resurgence had come. The news spread quickly, though it was never broadcast. There were no grand speeches or banners raised in the streets. Instead, it began with whispers, small, hidden conversations in the dark corners of the galaxy, in back alleys and forgotten stations. Humans had always been survivors, adapting to whatever the galaxy threw at them, and now they were awakening to something that would make them more than survivors. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, not by a central leader or an organized faction, but by the scattered few who had felt the stirrings of ancient power within them. Mira, now on the run after her violent outburst, had spent weeks wandering the wilderness of her home planet, trying to understand the forces raging inside her. She had no answers, only more questions. The visions were relentless, flashes of an ancient Earth, battles fought in long-forgotten wars, people who bore a resemblance to her, but wore the weight of untold power. She knew there was something more to these dreams, something calling her. She wasn't alone in this awakening. The signs were everywhere if you knew where to look. On the fringes of the known galaxy, Jackson found himself in the same position, though his situation was even more dire. His discovery of his abilities had drawn the attention of the authorities, and now he was being hunted. The Exarchs, in their usual arrogance, believed that humanity was too fractured to pose any real threat. They were wrong. In the shadows, Jackson discovered something that gave him hope, another human like him. His name was Kale, a former soldier who had fought in the wars of old, and whose latent abilities had recently come to life with violent consequences. Kale was already leading a small underground group, a loose coalition of humans who had experienced similar transformations, and who now had one singular goal: to find the others and rebuild what was lost. The two met in secret, exchanging tales of their awakenings, their visions, and the strange abilities coursing through their bodies. Kale spoke of the legends, stories passed down through the generations, of humanity's dominance, of wars fought on worlds so far away that even the stars themselves had been dimmed by the memory. These were no ordinary stories. They were echoes of a time when humans were the galaxy's undisputed rulers, with powers that transcended the physical, powers that were now starting to resurface. As Jackson and Kale's group grew, so did their strength. They found others, each one gifted in different ways, with powers that ranged from enhanced physical abilities to telekinetic control over machines and the elements. These new recruits were just as scared as they were determined, unsure of what was happening to them, but unwilling to let the opportunity slip away. They shared a sense of urgency, a collective drive to fight back. The Exarchs had to be stopped before they could crush this fledgling movement. Mira, having received a signal from Jackson's group, made her way to the rendezvous point, now determined to join the resistance. There was no longer any doubt in her mind. They were part of something bigger, something that could not be ignored. The power within them had a purpose. It had been dormant for too long. And now, with the galaxy's oppressors turning a blind eye, humanity's time was coming. The Exarchs, as powerful and confident as they were, had underestimated the strength of humanity. They had believed humanity was a fractured, broken race, but the truth was far different. Something was stirring within every human across the stars. The whispers of rebellion were growing louder, and in the shadows, those who had once been oppressed were beginning to realize that the galaxy would not belong to the alien overlords for much longer. The Exarchs had ruled the galaxy for centuries with an iron grip, their shadowy presence stretching across every corner of the known universe. These ancient beings, ageless and cruel, had ensured that humanity remained broken and scattered, incapable of rising again. They had seen to it that Earth's once glorious empire was erased from history, its legends buried under layers of lies and forgotten truths. They believed humanity's rebellion was a relic of the past, something that could never return to threaten their rule. But now, something was happening, something they could not ignore. They felt it in the currents of the universe, in the strange disturbances that rippled through the fabric of space. The humans, those insignificant creatures they had long dismissed, were beginning to awaken. The first reports came from the outer reaches, where a small band of resistance fighters, led by Jackson and Kale, began to stir trouble in the colonies. At first, the Exarchs dismissed it as a nuisance, a minor uprising that would burn itself out in time. But when the energy signatures from these human actions began to show signs of abnormality, powers that they hadn't seen since the days of the original human empire, the Exarchs began to take notice. In the darkened war chambers of the Exarch capital, Valthar, the eldest and most powerful of the Exarchs, convened with his inner circle. They were ancient, their minds sharp and calculating, but even they could not predict the full scope of the change that was sweeping across humanity. Valthar's cold, calculating eyes narrowed as he studied the reports. The humans had never demonstrated such power before, not even in their prime. Their sudden rise could not be a coincidence. These humans are no longer the weak creatures we remember, Valthar said, his voice like the chill of deep space. Something has changed. We must crush this rebellion before it grows. His advisors nodded in agreement. The Exarchs had already deployed their best assassins, the Necrons, a ruthless order of elite warriors tasked with rooting out any threats to their rule. They were relentless, trained to hunt down even the most elusive enemies, and they would not stop until every last human with the potential to rise was dead. But the Necrons would not be enough. Valthar knew that. There was something more behind this uprising, something they could not yet understand. The energy signatures from the humans were far too concentrated, far too powerful for mere coincidence. This was no ordinary rebellion. This was the resurgence of humanity's ancient strength, the very power that had once made them rulers of the stars. The Exarchs knew they had to act swiftly. In the depths of the Exarch Empire, on a planet untouched by time, an ancient artifact lay hidden. The Exarchs had long believed this weapon was lost, but Valthar knew better. This weapon had the power to suppress the very abilities that had been awakened in humanity. He had once used it to crush rebellions before they could start, to extinguish the flickering flame of resistance. It was time to activate it again. Meanwhile, Jackson and his growing band of rebels were unaware of the Exarchs' plans. They had found one another in the shadows of the galaxy, united by their powers and their shared vision of a future free from oppression. But as their forces gathered and their mission became clearer, the weight of their newfound abilities grew. The more they learned, the more they realized how much they didn't know. The power within them was not without cost, and the risk of losing control was ever present. But there was no turning back. The Exarchs had marked them as a threat, and the galaxy would soon see that humanity's awakening could not be so easily stopped. The Exarchs, in all their arrogance, had underestimated humanity once before. This time, they would not make that mistake again. The time had come for humanity's scattered forces to make their first bold move. Jackson and Kale had spent weeks strategizing, carefully gathering allies, and preparing for a mission that would send a message to the galaxy. The humans who had once ruled the stars were awakening, and they would no longer be subjugated. Their target was a key Exarch stronghold, a heavily fortified world that was home to one of the last remaining pieces of the Exarch's control over humanity. If they could strike here, they would cripple the Exarch's ability to suppress the rebellion. The planet was called Varian, a remote but vital world where the Exarchs stored vital intelligence on humanity's lost history, as well as the advanced technology they had used to suppress human power. The Exarchs believed their secrets were safe here, tucked away in the planet's heavily guarded archives. But the rebels knew better. They understood that if they could unlock even a fraction of what lay hidden in those archives, they would have the knowledge to tip the balance of power in their favor. The plan was simple: infiltrate the planet's surface, access the archives, and retrieve the critical data. But of course, nothing was ever simple when dealing with the Exarchs. Jackson, Kale, and their team of awakened rebels, now a well-organized unit, were ready. The group included Mira, who had grown stronger with every passing day, and others like her, humans whose abilities ranged from telekinesis to the manipulation of energy itself. Their powers were still raw, not fully under control, but they had trained together, growing more confident in their strength and in each other. As they approached Varian's atmosphere, the rebels made their way aboard a stealth ship, a modified Exarch vessel they had captured months before. It was a calculated risk, using enemy technology, but it gave them a chance to slip past Varian's planetary defenses undetected. They entered the atmosphere just as night fell, the planet's surface bathed in shadows. Beneath them, the sprawling cityscape was guarded by legions of Exarch soldiers and automated defenses. all of which would need to be bypassed if the mission were to succeed. The team split into smaller groups to avoid detection, each tasked with a specific objective. Jackson and Kale led the assault on the central archives, while Mira and the others were to disable the planet's communications network to prevent any reinforcements from reaching the stronghold. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their task heavy on their shoulders. There was no room for error. Failure would mean certain death and the loss of their last chance to turn the tide. As they infiltrated the archives, they found the Exarch security far more intense than anticipated. The halls were filled with guards, and every step closer to the heart of the facility triggered more security measures. They fought their way through, using their powers to hold off the Exarch forces. Mira unleashed bursts of telekinetic force, sending guards crashing into walls, while Jackson used his newfound ability to manipulate energy to disable the facility's security systems. Every corner they turned brought them face to face with another deadly obstacle, but they pressed on, knowing the importance of their mission. Finally, they reached the central chamber, where the data they sought was stored. Just as they began to access the archives, a high-pitched alarm blared across the facility. The Exarchs had detected their presence, and reinforcements were on the way. The rebels had only moments before they would be overwhelmed. Jackson quickly transferred the most crucial files to a secure device, but just as they were about to leave, a massive explosion shook the building, sending them tumbling to the ground. Exarch soldiers, heavily armored and ruthless, had arrived in full force. The battle was far from over. The first strike had been successful, but now they would have to fight their way out of the heart of enemy territory. The mission on Varian had been a success, but the victory came at a cost. The rebel group had barely escaped the planet's surface with the critical data in hand, and the Exarch's forces were already mobilizing to retaliate. The fight was far from over. Jackson, Kale, and the others knew that their victory in the archives was only the beginning. The data they had recovered had led them to an ancient truth. Humanity's power had once been tied to a weapon capable of channeling the raw energy of the stars themselves. The weapon's pieces had been scattered across the galaxy, hidden away to ensure that no one could ever use it again. But the Exarchs knew about it, and they had gone to great lengths to keep it from falling into the hands of the human resistance. The map to the weapon's fragments was incomplete. The data they had uncovered only pointed to where the first pieces might be. To win this war, to reclaim humanity's place in the galaxy, they needed to find the remaining fragments and reassemble the weapon. But the hunt would not be easy. Each fragment was buried deep within hostile territories, guarded by forces loyal to the Exarchs, or in places where few dared venture. Jackson sat with Kale and Mira, poring over the data they had recovered. The first fragment, the one closest to them, was located on a remote planet in the Far-Reach system. It was an old mining colony, abandoned long ago after an Exarch-led massacre. The planet was now a wasteland, its surface scarred by years of brutal occupation. Few knew of its significance, but the weapon fragment lay beneath the ruined city, hidden away in a forgotten vault. Getting to it would mean navigating the deadly, treacherous ruins and avoiding the deadly automated defenses that still lingered on the planet. Kale clenched his fists, his mind already racing through the strategies. We don't have the luxury of time. The Exarchs won't sit idly by while we hunt down their most dangerous weapon. They'll be sending everything they've got to stop us. Mira nodded, her eyes hardening. We've already made it this far. We can't stop now. They all knew the stakes. Each fragment was a key to unlocking the full power of humanity's lost legacy. And with every piece they recovered, they would grow stronger. The Exarch's hold on the galaxy would slip further, their grip loosening just enough to allow the resistance to take hold. But it was dangerous work, each fragment guarded by vicious alien creatures, ruthless Exarch agents, or worse, traps designed to prevent anyone from ever reaching the weapon again. Jackson could feel the weight of their mission pressing on him. Each decision would have consequences, and every failure could mean the end of the rebellion before it even began. But there was no turning back. The first fragment was within their reach, and they would stop at nothing to claim it. As the rebels prepared to leave for the far-reach system, word came in from other parts of the galaxy. More human cells were awakening, and whispers of other fragments being located had begun to surface. Each piece of the weapon would bring them closer to their goal, but it would also bring them closer to the full wrath of the Exarchs. With little time to waste, the group boarded their ship, ready for the next leg of their journey. The hunt for the fragments had begun, and humanity's fate now rested on the strength of these few rebels willing to face the unknown in their fight for freedom. The Exarchs might still be in the shadows, but the rebels were no longer afraid to challenge them. The weapon was their key to victory, and they would find every piece, no matter the cost. The journey to the far-reach system was perilous, but the rebels had grown accustomed to danger. Jackson, Kale, Mira, and the rest of the group were prepared for whatever the Exarchs or the planet itself might throw at them. The planet was a desolate wasteland, its once thriving mining colonies now reduced to ruins, haunted by the ghosts of a brutal past. As they descended toward the planet's surface, the group felt the weight of their mission. Finding the fragment of the weapon hidden deep within the abandoned city would require more than just skill. It would require strength, determination, and trust. But trust, Jackson soon learned, was something he could no longer take for granted. The planet's surface was bathed in an eerie, perpetual twilight. Dust storms howled across the wastelands, obscuring their vision as they made their way toward the ruined city. They landed just outside the city's perimeter, the ship's engines coughing out their final breaths after the long journey. It would be a long trek to the vault where the fragment was supposedly stored, but they had no choice. The Exarch soldiers had already been alerted to their presence. Jackson looked around at his team. The tension was palpable. Kale's face was set, his expression grim as he scanned the horizon for signs of danger. Mira was quieter than usual, lost in thought, her powers now becoming both a gift and a burden she struggled to control. But it was one of their own, their newest recruit, Ethan, who was the real cause of concern. Ethan had joined the rebellion only recently, a quiet young man with an unsettling past. He had claimed to be a former Exarch informant who had grown disillusioned with the oppression, but something about him didn't sit right with Jackson. His knowledge of the Exarch's operations was too precise, his ability to move through dangerous territory too smooth. Still, they had little choice but to trust him, as he was their best hope of navigating the ruins and avoiding the deadly traps that lay ahead. As the group made their way through the skeletal remains of the city, their steps slow and deliberate, Jackson kept a close eye on Ethan. The young man had been acting strangely for the past few hours, his movements stiff, his gaze darting around like a predator on edge. It wasn't until they reached the central courtyard that Jackson's worst fears were realized. A sharp click echoed in the air, a sound Jackson knew all too well. A trap had been triggered. The ground beneath them gave way, and the rebels found themselves plunged into darkness, their bodies tumbling into a deep underground cavern. Before they could react, the sound of footsteps echoed through the blackness above them. Ethan's voice, calm and cold, reached them from above. "I'm sorry, but this is where our paths diverge." Jackson's heart sank. Ethan wasn't one of them. He had never been. From the shadows above, the faintest outline of Ethan's silhouette became clear. He wasn't alone. Behind him, a group of Exarch soldiers appeared, their glowing eyes cold and calculating, weapons drawn. Ethan had betrayed them. "I didn't join your rebellion to fight for a future that was never meant to be," Ethan continued, his voice hollow, detached. "The Exarchs gave me everything. You're never meant to win. I'll make sure you never get the weapon. This is where your resistance ends." Rage surged within Jackson, his fists clenching at his sides. But before he could react, the Exarch soldiers began to descend, their weapons aimed squarely at the trapped rebels. Ethan's betrayal stung more than any wound. He had been the one they had trusted, the one they had relied on to guide them through the most dangerous mission they had ever attempted. Mira, her face filled with disbelief and anger, stepped forward, her powers sparking around her. "You've made a terrible mistake, Ethan," she said, her voice low but filled with undeniable power. Jackson knew they had to act fast. If they didn't escape now, the Exarchs would wipe them out before they could even make it to the fragment. The fight for their future had just become far more dangerous. But they weren't finished yet, not by a long shot. With a roar, Jackson unleashed his power, breaking through the rubble that trapped them. The rebels had been betrayed, but they still had the strength to fight back. The war was far from over. The betrayal had shattered the trust that had held the rebellion together, but it also ignited something deep within Jackson. The trap set by Ethan and the Exarchs only sharpened his resolve. The rebels were wounded, disoriented, but not broken. As the Exarch soldiers closed in, Jackson's mind raced. He could feel the latent power within him, the dormant strength that had begun to surface ever since he had first discovered his abilities. It was raw, untamed, and now it was roaring to be unleashed. Mira was already in motion, her powers crackling like static in the air. She reached out, her hands glowing with the force of her telekinesis, and ripped apart the stone and metal that had trapped them. The walls around them shook, dust pouring from the ceiling as the Exarch soldiers scrambled to adjust. But Jackson didn't wait for the chaos to unfold. His powers surged within him, the ancient energy flowing through his veins, and he felt the connection to something far greater than himself. It was like tapping into the bloodline of humanity's greatest warriors, the same warriors who had once commanded the stars. Without warning, Jackson's body was surrounded by an intense glow of energy. The air itself seemed to bend and distort around him, his mind and body united in a surge of power. He could hear the hum of energy, feel the ancient force awakening inside him, a power that had been dormant for millennia. It was the legacy of humanity's strength, a power that had been hidden for far too long. And now it was free. The first Exarch soldier lunged at him, but Jackson didn't move. Instead, the air around him cracked with an unseen force, and the soldier was flung back with enough power to slam into the cavern wall. The shockwave reverberated through the chamber, sending the rest of the soldiers into disarray. The Exarchs had underestimated them, just as they had done with humanity in the past. But this time, Jackson and his team would not be ignored. Mira, now fully embracing her powers, joined in, her hands glowing with a force that ripped through the air. She hurled debris at the soldiers, her telekinetic abilities moving with a precision that left no room for escape. The remaining Exarch forces fell back, surprised by the intensity of the human resistance. The rebels were no longer just fighting for survival, they were fighting with the strength of their ancestors, the very bloodline that had once ruled the galaxy. Kale was at the forefront, using his combat skills to engage the soldiers head-on, his movements swift and deadly. His training in the old wars made him a force to be reckoned with, and he moved with a purpose, cutting through the Exarch forces as if they were nothing more than obstacles in his path. But even as the Exarch soldiers were overwhelmed, Jackson knew this was just the beginning. Ethan's betrayal had given them a glimpse into the Exarch's deeper plans. They were prepared to do whatever it took to stop the rebels, and the weapon fragments were only a small part of their greater scheme. If humanity was to succeed in their fight for freedom, they would need more than just the fragments. They would need to fully unlock the power that ran through their blood, the power of the ancient empire that had once ruled the stars. Jackson's mind burned with this realization. The time for fear and hesitation was over. The power within them was too great to hide any longer. It was time to unleash humanity's true strength, to rise up and reclaim their place in the galaxy. With a final burst of energy, Jackson sent out a shockwave that knocked the remaining soldiers to the ground, their weapons scattering. As the last of the Exarch's forces fled or fell, Jackson stood tall, his heart pounding with the energy of the Bloodline awakened. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: humanity was no longer a scattered race, afraid of its own potential. The Bloodline had been unleashed, and with it, a new chapter in the rebellion had begun. The Exarchs would not know what hit them. The cavern was still, the only sound the heavy breaths of the rebels as they stood amidst the wreckage of the Exarch soldiers. Jackson's pulse was racing, the energy from the battle still crackling in the air. His powers had surged in ways he could never have anticipated, and he felt the weight of humanity's ancient strength coursing through him. They had won this skirmish, but the war was far from over. The Exarchs would regroup, adapt, and retaliate, but this time, humanity was ready. The first spark had ignited, and now nothing could stop the fire from spreading. Mira, her powers still vibrating through her, walked toward Jackson, her expression one of fierce determination. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked, her voice a mix of awe and certainty. "They're going to come for us with everything they have." Jackson met her gaze. He had seen the same thing in her eyes that he felt in his own heart, the undeniable truth that the fight was only just starting. The Exarchs, powerful and ancient as they were, had underestimated the power they had long kept dormant within humanity. It had taken centuries for the galaxy to forget the greatness of the human race, but now the galaxy would remember. "We have what they fear now," Jackson said, his voice steady but charged with resolve. "We have the Bloodline, and we have each other. We're no longer scattered and weak. We are united in a way they cannot comprehend." The team gathered around, each member feeling the weight of their newfound power. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future, for the restoration of their people's legacy. The Exarchs had ruled for far too long, but their reign was crumbling, piece by piece, as humanity awakened to its true potential. The map they had recovered from Varian held the key to more fragments of the weapon, and they now knew their next move. But before they could even consider the next phase of their journey, the message came through. The Exarchs had already begun their counterattack. Massive fleets were mobilizing, moving toward the rebels' last known location. The storm that was coming would be unlike anything they had faced before. Kale, ever the strategist, was the first to speak. "We don't run. We've got the element of surprise, and we need to take it to them. If we can strike before they bring their full force to bear, we might be able to turn the tide. We've got to keep hitting them, keep them on the defensive." Jackson nodded, his mind already shifting into battle mode. "We'll take the fight to their fleets. If we can hit their command centers, we disrupt their entire operation. We have to make them realize we're not just a nuisance anymore. We're a threat, one they can't ignore." Mira stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a mixture of excitement and urgency. "We have the power, Jackson. The Bloodline is within us. If we can harness it, we can break through their defenses. We've done the impossible before. We can do it again." The rebels had come together, each of them embracing their roles in the coming battle. They had no illusions about the scale of the conflict ahead, but they also knew that they could not let the Exarchs dictate their fate any longer. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment they would take the fight to their oppressors and reclaim the galaxy as their own. As the rebel ship prepared to launch, Jackson looked out at the stars. For so long, humanity had been silent, forgotten, and oppressed. But now they were awake. The Bloodline had been awakened, and with it, a new chapter in the history of the universe. The Exarchs had ruled the stars for too long, but their time was ending. Humanity was rising. "Let's go," Jackson said, his voice resolute. "We're taking the fight to them. We're taking back the stars." And as the rebel fleet jumped into hyperspace, the galaxy held its breath. The rise of humanity had begun.